The coroner ruled it a homicide. The jury called it manslaughter, and his family called it murder. First of all, Michael told me that they were going to murder him. He was the most famous person alive, and he sold more records than anyone in history, and he owned a catalog worth billions. And he spent his final years telling everyone around him that someone was going to kill him for it, but nobody listened. And then, in 2024, his name resurfaced in the Epstein files, and the whole world started asking questions again. But they were asking the wrong ones. This is the mysterious life and death of Michael Jackson. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murderers. All things that I love to consume. And I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Today, we are talking about one of the most famous human beings ever, and how he came to be that famous, and what happened because of it. And there's a lot of things in here I had no idea about, especially with all the Epstein stuff coming out and everything. It is going to be a jam-packed video. So, without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this Michael Jackson life and death deep dive video together. So, the story of Michael Jackson begins not with him, but with a place and with the people that place made. Gary, Indiana, was a company town in the most literal sense, founded in 1906 by the United States Steel Corporation and named for the chairman of its board, Albert Henry Gary. The city existed to feed the furnaces. Gary Works, stretching along the southern shore of Lake Michigan, would grow into the largest steel mill on Earth, and the jobs would draw tens of thousands of families northward during the Great Migration. And by 1960, the population would peak at around 178,000 people. And the air in this place just tasted like metal, and the work was dangerous, and the pay was steady, and the neighborhoods were segregated, and the churches were full on Sundays. And among those who came north was a man born into that migration's current, Joseph Walter Jackson, who arrived in the world on July 26th, 1928, in Fountain Hill, a small community in Ashley County, Arkansas, and deep in that flat cotton country of the southeastern delta, barely a mile from the Louisiana line. And his father, Samuel Joseph Jackson, was a school teacher the locals would call Professor Jackson, and his mother was Crystal Leak Ing. So the family carried within it the tangled bloodlines of the American South. Joe's grandfather, Israel Nero Jackson, born in 1838, had been enslaved, and his great-grandfather July Jack Gale was said to have been a U.S. Army scout who claimed Native American heritage, though the specifics of that claim, sometimes identified as Choctaw, are difficult to verify through surviving records. So, Joe moved to East Chicago, Indiana, at 18, and he was a physically imposing man with large hands and a hard stare. And he found work in the way other African-American men in the region found work, at the mills. And he would become an overhead crane operator at Inland Steel Company, and later worked at American Foundries, also in East Chicago. And the hours working there were long, and the labor was grinding, and somewhere in the repetition of shifts and paychecks, Joe Jackson began to understand that he wanted something else, something that made noise, that moved a crowd, that refused to be ordinary. And the woman who would share that wanting and temper it with something quieter and more enduring had her own story of migration and survival. Terrible. Screws was born on May 4th, 1930, in Clayton, a town in Barber County, Alabama, the same red clay country that produced George Wallace. And at 2 years old, she would contract polio, and the disease would leave her with a permanent limp and a slight drag in her left leg that she would carry for the rest of her life. And when she was 4, the family would move north to East Chicago, joining the same stream of Southern African-American families chasing the promise of the mills. But despite the polio, Katie, who would later go by Catherine, was deeply musical. She played piano, clarinet, and the cello, and she sang. And she absorbed the country gospel of her Alabama childhood and the rhythms of Indiana, and she would carry music inside her the way some people carry prairie prayer. So, Joe and Catherine met in 1947 in East Chicago. She was 17 at the time, and he was already briefly married to a woman named I.S. Sophina Kenson, though that marriage was very short-lived. So, Joe and Catherine married on November 5th, 1949, and in January 1950, they purchased a small house at 2300 Jackson Street in Gary for $8,500. Different times, I'll tell you what don't miss time. And the house was around 670 square feet with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and it's on a modest lot in a working-class neighborhood on the west side of Gary, close enough to the mill that you could hear the machinery if the wind was right. And into the house over the next 16 years, Joe and Catherine Jackson would bring 10 children, a quantity of human life that the square footage could barely contain. Stacked in bunk beds, sharing everything. Privacy, a concept that existed only in theory. So, in the early 1950s, Joe and his brother Luther formed a blues band called the Falcons, sometimes known as Ford Falcons. And Joe played guitar, and Luther played saxophone, and they gigged around the region in the networks of industrial cities south of Chicago that included Gary, East Chicago, and Hammond, playing the kind of electric blues that poured out of every juke joint and house party in those neighborhoods. And they were pretty decent, but the Falcons would never land any record deal. And after a few years, the band dissolved and Joe put his guitar in the closet, but he did not put away the ambition, as we know, and he folded it up and stored it somewhere deeper, in a place where it would eventually be redirected with ferocious, sometimes brutal precision, and that was toward his children. Now, the children came in rapid succession, and each one entered a household that was growing louder, more crowded, and more volatile. Now, Maureen Raylette, or Rebby E., was born first on May 29, 1950, and then Sigmund Desco, or Jackie, on May 4, 1951, and then Toria Noe Darrell, or Tito, on October 15, 1953, and then Jermaine on December 11, 1954, and then Lot Oyer Avad on May 29, 1956. Then Marlon David on March 12, 1957, along with his twin brother Brandon, who drew a single breath and died the next day, unfortunately, on March 13, 1957. And the death of Brandon was not discussed in the Jackson household. It was absorbed into the silence that families built around their worst losses, just a ghost twin whose absence Marlon could carry quietly for decades. And then on August 29, 1958, at St. Mary's Mercy Hospital in Gary, Michael Joseph Jackson was born. And he was the 8th child, the 7th living technically, and he had arrived in a house that was already overflowing with children, with noise, with Joe's thwarted ambitions, and Catherine's quiet faith, and the ever-present economic pressure of a steelworker's wage stretched across a family that would eventually number 11. And two more children would follow, Stephen Randall, or Randy, on October 29, 1961, and Janet Demita Joe on May 16, 1966. And in 1963, Catherine would convert to the Jehovah's Witness faith and was baptized. And the religion which shaped the Jackson household profoundly with its door-to-door evangelism, and its prohibition on holidays and birthdays, its apocalyptic worldview, its emphasis on spiritual discipline, and its emphasis on spiritual discipline. And it was Catherine's faith, not Joe's, and it would live inside Michael Jackson for the rest of his life, even as he struggled with it, even as he left and returned to it, and even as it complicated everything. Now, Joe Jackson was, by virtually every account, including those of his children, a strict and sometimes physically abusive father because he demanded obedience and he demanded excellence. And when the guitar came back out of the closet, this time not for Joe's own playing but for his son's, the discipline that governed the household became something closer to a regime. Now, the guitar was forbidden, and that was the rule. Joe kept it in the bedroom closet, a cheap electric model, nothing special. But it was his, a relic of the Falcons and the dream that hadn't worked out, and the children were not to touch it. Because Joe was at the mill during the day and the children were not supervised every minute. Tito, the third born, the quiet one, the one with the large hands like his father's, could not stay away from it. And he would wait until Joe left for his shift, then slide the closet door open and take out the guitar carefully, the way you would handle something you've been told to never handle. and he would teach himself to play by ear, picking out the songs he heard on the radio. The Temptations, the Four Tops, the electric blues his father used to play in the clubs. And he was getting pretty good. And then one day in 1964, he broke a string, and the discovery could have gone badly because, in the Jackson household, disobedience was met with a belt, a switch, or a cord, whatever was in the closet. But something shifted in Joe when he heard Tito play. The boy had talent, real talent. And Joe Jackson, the man whose own band had never gotten a record deal, the crane operator who went to work every day in a city that was already beginning to die, recognized in his son's stolen guitar playing the second chance he had been waiting for. So he didn't punish Ito. He bought him a guitar. And what followed was the formation of a family band with the discipline of a military unit and the ambition of a Fortune 500 company. And in 1964, Joe organized the Jackson brothers, Tito on guitar, Jackie and Jermaine on vocals, plus to neighborhood friends, Raymond Jones and Milford Height, filling out the rhythm. And they rehearsed in the living room of 2300 Jackson Street in that 672 square foot house where the walls were thin enough to hear everything, and the neighbors could hear them too. And Joe ran rehearsals the way he ran everything, with absolute authority. Guy was a tyrant, and mistakes were not tolerated, and repetition was the method. Fear was the motivator, and by August 1965, two more Jackson brothers had joined the group, Marlon, who was 8, and Michael, who was only 6 years old. And the neighborhood friends would slowly be eased out because this was now all a Jackson operation. And at a performance at Gary's Tiny Tots Jamboree, a woman named Evelyn Lawhane suggested the group needed a proper name. And someone, accounts vary on exactly who, proposed the Jackson 5 and the name stuck. And Michael, at 6 years old, was not yet the lead singer, though that role belonged to Jermaine, who had a smooth, reliable tenor. And Michael sang, back up, and danced. But even in those earliest performances, talent shows at elementary schools, community centers, local clubs where children probably shouldn't have been, something was visibly different about the youngest performer on stage. He moved with an intuition that couldn't be taught. He watched James Brown on television with the focus of a graduate student, absorbing every spin, every split, every way Brown used his body to make the crowd lose its utter mind. And he studied Jackie Wilson, and he studied the Temptations choreography, and then he did it better than any child had a right to. And in 1966, the Jackson 5 won their first talent show at Theodore Roosevelt High School in Gary, and it was the beginning of a streak, and Joe entered them into every competition he could find, driving them across Indiana. The family packed into a Volkswagen van that barely held them all, and they won, and they kept winning. And Joe booked them into rougher venues, bars, strip clubs, places where a group of children performed between adult acts, and the audience threw money if they were good in bottles if they weren't. Just sketchy as fuck places where kids should not be. And Michael later described watching striptease acts as a small child, standing in the wings waiting for the Jackson 5's turn. And he was now 9 years old. And by mid-1967, a shift had taken place within the group that everyone could hear. Michael's voice, still a child's voice, still high and clear, had developed a quality that Jermaine simply didn't possess. And it was just range or pitch. It was just emotion and almost unsettling ability to inhabit all lyrics feeling and project it outward with adult conviction. So Joe made a decision. Michael replaced Jermaine as lead singer. Damn. So the group's center of gravity moved permanently to the youngest brother on stage. And on August 13, 1967, they won amateur night at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, the most famous proving ground of African-American entertainment and the stage where Ella Fitzgerald and James Brown and Stevie Wonder had been discovered, where the audience was legendary, wryly unforgiving, and the hook was not a metaphor. And at this point, Michael was 8 years old, and the Apollo audience gave them a standing ovation. So the question of who discovered the Jackson 5 is one of the foundational myths of the Motown era, and like most myths, it obscures a messier truth. The official story is the one that Berry Gordy wanted told, the one printed on the debut album cover, which was that Diana Ross discovered the Jackson 5. But it was just a marketing masterstroke. the biggest female star in black music presenting the next generation, a laying on of hands from Motown royalty to Motown future. The first Jackson 5 album was titled Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5, and Ross appeared at their early press events, and the implication was clear and very deliberate. And it was also largely fiction, which at this point, it started back then, though. All the stuff like I went over Taylor Swift and how her whole life was manufactured. It's interesting looking at the parallels, and I've only gone into the major artists now, but the parallels are crazy. How much they're manufactured and how much smoke and mirrors there are in the entertainment industry. But the true discoverer was Bobby Taylor, a singer and bandleader from Motown's second tier who fronted Bobby Taylor and the Vancouver S. Because Taylor saw the Jackson 5 perform at the Regal Theater in Chicago, the South Side equivalent of the Apollo, and was stunned. And he brought them to Motown's attention, arranged their audition, and produced their early recordings. And Gladys Knight also deserves a footnote in the discovery narrative because she saw the Jackson 5 at the Regal in 1967 as well and was so impressed that she sent an demo tape to Motown on their behalf, but the tape was rejected. The irony is almost too good because one of Motown's biggest stars recommending a group that would become Motown's biggest act was being ignored. But the formal audition took place on July 23, 1968 at Hitsville, USA, Motown's legendary headquarters on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, the converted house with a hand-painted sign that had produced more #1 hits than any address in America. And the Jackson brothers performed in the studio, and Berry Gordy, contrary to what some accounts have suggested, was not present for the audition, and he saw a tape of it later. But the Motown staff who were in the room that day knew immediately what they were looking at. Michael, now 9 years old, performed with a precision and emotional range that was difficult to reconcile with his age. And he sang like a man who had been heartbroken, and he had never been on a date at this point, obviously, because he's 9. And Motown signed the Jackson 5, and the machine began to turn. So in mid-August 1916, Joe moved the boys to California, and Catherine and the rest of the children didn't join until November. For the Jackson brothers from Gary, Indiana, from the 670-square-foot house on Jackson Street, from the steel smoke air in the frozen winters and the talent shows at Theodore Roosevelt High, Los Angeles was another planet. The light was different, the air smelled like jasmine instead of sulfur, and the houses had swimming pools. And on October 1st, 1916, Michael, now 11 years old, moved temporarily into the Hollywood Hills home of Diana Ross home, and he lived with her for about a month while the family's permanent arrangements were being finalized. And Ross became a kind of surrogate older sister and glamorous mentor to Michael, and Michael absorbed her elegance, her poise, her understanding of how a star just occupied space, and he watched her the way he watched everything, just silently, totally storing it all for later use. And then Motown released the single, and the velocity of what happened next has no real parallel in the history of popular music, because on October 7th, 1916, less than 2 months after the family arrived in California, Motown released I Want You Back, the Jackson 5's debut single. The song was a masterpiece of pure pop construction, a bouncing bass line, staccato piano chords, a horn section that punched like a fist. And riding above all of it was the voice of an 11-year-old boy singing about romantic heartbreak with conviction that made you forget he was 11. Because the vocal performance was technically extraordinary, with the phrasing, the breath control, the way Michael bent notes and slid between registers, but what made it transcendent was something harder to name. There was joy in it, there was urgency, there was a child's voice carrying an adult's emotion within it without any question, and the effect was just electrifying. And I Want You Back reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on January 31st, 1970, and Michael Jackson was 11 years old, making him the youngest artist to ever top the chart. And the record sold over 2 million copies in its first 6 weeks. And what followed was just unprecedented, and the Jackson 5 became the first recording act in history to debut with 4 consecutive #1 singles. Not the first group, not the first family act, but the first act of any kind. and the streak unfolded with the mechanical precision of a Motown hit factory operating at peak efficiency. I Want You Back. No Want You Back. 1 January 31st, 1970. ABC. No. 1 April 25th, 1970. The song knocked the Beatles. Let It Be out of the top spot, which is crazy. It was just a symbolic passing of the generational torch that the music press seized upon with just utter glee. And then The Love You Save. No. 1 June 27th, 1970. And I'll Be There, which is no it worked on this time. 1 October 17th, 1970. And this one was a ballad. The one that proved the Jackson 5 were not merely a novelty act built on energy and choreography. I'll Be There was tender and restrained and just very sincere, and Michael sang it as though comforting someone through a crisis. And the performance was so emotionally mature that it unsettled people even, because where the hell did a child learn to just feel like that? How did a boy from a two-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana, develop the capacity to communicate grief and reassurance with the authority of someone who had already lived a full life? And nobody had an answer. And the song became the Jackson 5's biggest selling single, moving over 4 million copies. For singles for number ones, 9 months. The group had arrived in California as unknowns and became by the end of 1970 the biggest act in popular music. So the fame was crazy, and by 1971, the Jackson 5 had their own Saturday morning cartoon, Jackson 5 IV, with the 5 IV instead of the 5, which aired on ABC from 1971 to 1972, rendering the brothers as animated characters in weekly adventures. And they were on lunchboxes, and bedroom posters, and magazine covers, and teenage girls screamed at their concerts that drew comparisons to Battlemania. And the Jackson 5 were selling out arenas across the country, and at the center of every performance, drawing every eye, generating every gasp, was Michael. And that very year, the family purchased the Hay-V-E-N Hurst Estate, a sprawling compound on a tree-lined street in Encino, in the San Fernando Valley, for approximately $250,000. And the Jackson 5 had crossed this line in less than 5 years. And Michael at this point was 12 years old. He was the most famous child in America by far. And the machine was just getting started as Michael Jackson's solo recording career began while he was still a child inside of this machine. And in June 1971, at 12 years old, he entered Motown's studio without his brothers for the first time. And his debut solo single, Got to Be There, was released that October, a gentle, yearning love song that proved his voice could carry a record on its own. And the following year, Ben, a ballad sung to a rat from the horror film of the same name, became his first Warren-Pop solo single. And he was 13 at that point, and he had one hit, and a Saturday morning cartoon, and a family act that was still selling out arenas. And none of it was enough, not for Joe, and not for Michael either, and increasingly not for the brothers who were growing restless under Motown's ironclad creative control. And the break came in 1975, though, and the Jacksons signed a contract with CBS Records' Epic label in June, leaving Motown behind. And the reasons were partly financial, because Motown had been paying a royalty rate of 7%, a figure that bordered on exploitative even by the standards of the era, while Epic offered dramatically more. But the deeper issue was creative freedom. And at Motown, the Jackson 5 recorded songs chosen for them, produced by staff producers with virtually no input into their own material. And Epic would promise them the right to write and produce. But there was a cost. Motown retained ownership of the name Jackson 5, forcing the group to rebrand as the Jacksons. And Jermaine, married to Berry Gordy's daughter Hazel, stayed behind at Motown, a choice that fractured something in the family they never fully healed from. So the moment Michael Jackson stopped being a former child star and became something unprecedented arrived through a movie musical nobody expected to matter. And in 1977, Jackson was cast as the Scarecrow in The Wiz, an all-African-American reimaging of The Wizard of Oz starring Diana Ross. And the film itself was a commercial disappointment, actually, but on set, Jackson met Quincy Jones, legendary producer and arranger, who was serving as the film's musical supervisor and producer. Now, Jones was 44, a veteran of Count Basie's orchestra in France, a man who had worked at the highest levels of jazz, pop, film scoring, and R&B for 3 decades. A big deal, all right. And he heard something in the now 19-year-old Michael Jackson that went beyond talent, a perfectionism and obsessive work ethic, a willingness to be pushed, probably from his father. And Jackson asked Jones to produce his next solo album, and Jones agreed. So they recorded from December 1978 through June 1979, and Off the Wall was released on August 10th, 1979, and it was a revelation. If you know anything about Michael Jackson, the future album just fused disco, funk, pop, and R&B into something seamlessly sophisticated, just adult music made by a 20-year-old who sang with the authority of someone twice his age. Just like when he was a kid, he just had this maturity about himself and his voice that was just unprecedented. And don't stop till you get enough and rock with you. It's hard not to sing these titles. So don't stop till you get enough and rock with you both reached number 1. And the album sold over 20 million copies worldwide, and it won the Grammy for Best R&B Vocal Performance for Males, but it did not win Album of the Year somehow. And that loss stung Michael Jackson in a way that people around him recognized as something more than disappointment. It was just fuel for him, because he had made one of the best-selling albums in history, and the Recording Academy had just looked past it. And he told people close to him that the next album would be so big they couldn't ignore it. And he meant it. And what he made next was the best-selling album in the history of recorded music. Thriller was recorded between April 14th and November 8th of 1982 at Westlake Recording Studios in Los Angeles, with Quincy Jones again producing. And the budget was $750,000, expensive for the era but modest for what it became. And Jackson wrote 4 of the 9 tracks: Wanna Be Startin' Something, The Girl Is Mine, Beat It, and Billie Jean. Just masterpieces of music. Oh my god. Now the album was released on November 29th, 1982, and the numbers that followed defied any simple comprehension because Thriller spent 37 non-consecutive weeks at No. 1 on the Billboard 200. It was the best-selling album of 1983. It was the best-selling album of 1984. And all 7 of its singles reached the top 10. Billie Jean held the No. 1 spot for 7 weeks, and Beat It, which featured a guitar solo by Eddie Van Halen, who's one of my favorite guitarists ever, held it for 3. And estimated total sales have reached 70 million copies worldwide, a figure no other album has even approached. And I'm talking about one album specifically. Don't come in my comments and being like, oh, what about the Beatles or Taylor Swift? No? Okay. This is the top-selling album of all time, alright. But the cultural machinery around Thriller was as revolutionary as the music itself. And when MTV, still in its infancy and programming almost exclusively white rock acts, initially declined to air the Billie Jean video, CBS Records president Walter Yetnikoff reportedly threatened to pull all CBS content from the network. And MTV relented, and the video, Jackson in a pink shirt and white sequins aux, dancing under Streetleted on a sidewalk whose tiles illuminated beneath his feet, became the network's most requested clip and effectively integrated MTV EV. And the 13-minute Thriller short film, directed by John Landison, budgeted between $500,000 and $900,000, functioned less as a music video than a miniature horror movie. I remember the first time I watched it, my mind, it was blown, to say the least. But it was so elaborate that Michael Jackson, a practicing Jehovah's Witness troubled by the occult imagery, ordered the negatives destroyed before his attorney John Braga convinced him to simply add a disclaimer. And in 2009, it became the first music video inducted into the National Film Registry. And on February 28, 1984, Thriller won 8 Grammy Awards, a record at the time. But the image that sealed Thriller's mythology in the public consciousness had come 10 months earlier on a television stage because, on May 16, 1983, NBC broadcast Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, Forever, a reunion special celebrating Motown Records' 25th anniversary. And approximately 47 million people watched, which is a lot, and Jackson performed Billie Jean. And during the performance, in a moment that he had rehearsed privately for weeks, after learning the move from a dancer named Jaron Cuss Pair candidate in June 1981, he executed the moonwalk for the first time on live television. Iconic. And the other performers backstage watched the monitors in silence, and Fred Astaire called Jackson the next morning. And in a single, fluid, backward glide, 6 seconds, maybe 7, Michael Jackson passed from stardom into something that had no adequate name. In less than a year after the Motown 25 performance, on January 27, 1984, Michael Jackson was filming a Pepsi commercial at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. And on the 6th take, pyrotechnics ignited too close to his head, and his hair caught fire. And he suffered second-degree burns to his scalp, and crew members rushed to extinguish the flames. And Jackson was taken to hospital where he was treated and released. And Pepsi settled the resulting claim, and Jackson donated $5 million of the settlement to the Brotman Medical Center, which renamed its burn center in his honor. Just like so sweet. And his autopsy decades later would reveal that Jackson was almost completely bald beneath the wigs he wore for the rest of his life from that. But the deeper wound was pharmaceutical to manage the pain from the burn and subsequent reconstructive procedures. Jackson was prescribed opioid painkillers, and nearly every person close to him would later identify the Pepsi burn as the starting point of the prescription drug dependency that shadowed the rest of his life and ultimately contributed to his untimely death. But the third and final collaboration between Jackson and Quincy Jones was Bad, recorded from 1985 to 1987 and released on August 31st, 1987 and released on August 31st. And Michael Jackson wrote 9 of the album's 11 tracks, a dramatic increase in creative control from Thriller. And the album sold 25 million copies in its first week and generated a record 5 consecutive no-1 singles from a single album. And the title track's music video was directed by Martin Scorsese and featured a young Wesley Snipes. And total sales exceeded 35 million copies worldwide. And the Bad World Tour, September 12th, 1987 through January 27th, 1989 was 123 concerts across 15 countries, grossing $125 million. And Diana, Princess of Wales, attended the July 16, 1988 show at Wembley Stadium. And Bad was, by an objective measure, one of the most successful albums ever released. And it was also the first time Jackson encountered the peculiar burden of his own success, because Bad was treated in certain critical quarters as a disappointment, not because it failed by any measure, but because it was not Thriller. Because nothing could be. And the standard he had set was inhuman, and it would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his career. So in 1985, between the triumph of Thriller and the recording of Bad, Michael Jackson made the business decision that would define his financial life and, some believe, his death. Paul McCartney, during their collaborations on The Girl Is Mine and Say Say Say, had explained to Jackson how music publishing worked, that owning the rights to songs was where the real money lived, not performing or recording them. And Michael listened carefully. And when the ADV Music Publishing catalog came up for sale, a portfolio of roughly 4,000 songs, including 251 compositions by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Jackson pursued it aggressively. And the purchase closed on approximately August 10th, 1985 for $47.5 million. And Michael Jackson now owned Yesterday, Hey Jude, and Let It Be, and dozens of other songs that formed the bedrock of 20th century popular music. And McCartney, who wanted the catalog himself, was reportedly furious, and the friendship never recovered. And the catalog would appreciate enormously over the following decades, and in 1995 Michael Jackson merged his holdings with Sony Music's publishing division to create Sony ADV Music Publishing, a joint venture in which he retained a 50% stake. So by the time of his death, the catalog was valued at approximately $1 billion. And by 2016, when Sony purchased the estate's share for $750 million, estimates had climbed to $4 billion. So the catalog made Michael Jackson extraordinarily wealthy on paper, so it also made him a target. and he would spend the last years of his life telling people that someone was going to kill him for it. So after Bad, Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones parted ways professionally, and for Dangerous, released in 1991, Jackson turned to Teddy Riley, the pioneer of New Jack Swing. And the album's sound reflected the shift: harder, more rhythmically aggressive, and more experimental. And it was Jackson's first album without Jones since Forever Michael in 1975. It sold 32 million copies worldwide, and on January 31st, 1993, Jackson headlined the halftime show at the Super Bowl in Pasadena, and it was the first major music superstar to do so, and it's iconic. I mean, HES just like standing on stage and just the crowd screaming, and HES just sitting there, just soaking it in. It's the best Super Bowl in my opinion, right next to Prince. And the performance was a spectacle of unprecedented scale. Like I said, when Jackson stood motionless on stage for 90 seconds while the crowd roared, then launched into a medley that included Jam, Billie Jean, and Heal the World. It was the first Super Bowl halftime where ratings increased between halves, a phenomenon that transformed the halftime show from a bathroom break afterthought into the premier live performance slot in American entertainment. And every halftime spectacle since Prince, Beyoncé, Shakira, which are also amazing shows, exist in the template Jackson created that afternoon. And History, Past, Present, and Future, Book I, released in 1995, was a double album, one disc of greatest hits, one of new material, and it contained You Are Not Alone, which became the first song in Billboard history to debut at No. 1 on the Hot 100. And the History World Tour that followed him from 1996 to 1997 covered 80 to concerts across 35 countries and grossed $165 million, the highest grossing solo tour of the 90s. And by the mid-90s, Michael Jackson had sold more records than any solo artist in history, and he had invented the modern music video, and he had integrated MTV, and he had transformed the Super Bowl halftime show. He owned the most valuable music publishing catalog on earth, and he was by virtually any metric the most famous human being alive. And then everything began to fall apart, because behind the stage lights and the record sales and the increasingly surreal scale of the fame, there was a person, and that person was unwell in ways the public was only beginning to understand, and lonely in ways the public could not have imagined. And the health problems came first, and they came early. So, in 1983, going back a little bit in time, Dr. Arnold Klein, a Beverly Hills dermatologist who would become one of the most consequential and controversial figures in Jackson's life, diagnosed him with discoid lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune condition affecting the skin. And 3 years later, in 1996, Klein delivered a second diagnosis, vitiligo, a condition in which the immune system attacks the melanocytes that produce skin pigment, creating irregular patches of depigmentation across the body. And for any person, vitiligo is a difficult diagnosis. But for a black man who was the most photographed human being on the planet, a man whose changing appearance was already the subject of relentless tabloid speculation, it was catastrophic. And Jackson would not publicly disclose the vitiligo until February 10th, 1993, in a live interview with Oprah Winfrey watched by 90 million people. And by then, years of tabloid cruelty had calcified a narrative that Jackson was bleaching his skin out of self-hatred or racial confusion. But the truth was a medical condition he had not chosen and could not control. And his autopsy 16 years later would confirm the diagnosis definitively, documenting focal depigmentation across 5 areas of his body. And then came the Pepsi burn in January 1984, which we talked about previously, and with it the opioid prescriptions that introduced Jackson to a pharmaceutical world he would never fully leave. And in 1993, after the crisis that would engulf him that year, Elizabeth Taylor personally led an intervention, and Jackson entered rehab at a facility in London and completed a 12-step program. And the dependency retreated but did not disappear. It would return in different forms, with different substances, across different doctors for the rest of his life. And the most dangerous of those substances was propofol, a powerful intravenous anesthetic used in hospitals to induce unconsciousness for surgery. And Jackson began using propofol during the History World Tour, 1996 to 1997. Administered by anesthesiologists he hired to travel with him, and he used it to sleep. For a man suffering from chronic and debilitating insomnia, a condition that worsened with every passing year, propofol offered the only reliable path to unconsciousness. But it was not sleep in any medical sense. It suppressed REM cycles entirely, offering oblivion without rest time. And an expert who testified in 2013 estimated that Jackson may have gone 60 days without REM sleep before his death, which is catastrophic. So his brain by the end was being deprived of the very thing sleep is supposed to provide. And if Jackson's health was quietly deteriorating through the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds, his personal world was also taking shape in ways the public found endlessly fascinating and largely incomprehensible. The friendships came first, and the most important of them was Elizabeth Taylor. They met in the mid-1980 seconds, likely at a Victory Tour concert at Dodger Stadium in late 1984, and the connection was immediate and deep. To people who had been child stars, who had grown up inside fame's distortion field, who understood what it cost to be watched by millions before you understood who you even were. Taylor became Jackson's fiercest defender and closest confidant, and on April 12, 1989, at the Soul Train Awards, she introduced him with the title that would follow him permanently, the King of Pop. And on October 6, 1991, Michael Jackson hosted her 8th wedding to Larry for 10 Sky at Neverland Ranch, and their friendship lasted over 25 years until Taylor's death in 2011. And she was by many accounts one of the very few people on Earth who could speak to Michael Jackson honestly and be heard. And his meeting with Princess Diana was briefer, but no less meaningful to him, because on July 16, 1988, like we said before, Diana attended his Bad World Tour show at Wembley Stadium. And Jackson had removed Dirty Diana from the set list out of concern that the title might embarrass her. And Diana, learning of this, reportedly requested that he perform it, and he did. And they met only that once in person backstage at Wembley, and when Diana was killed in a car crash on August 31st, 1997, Jackson was so shaken that he postponed his scheduled performance in Austin, Belgium, moving it from August 31st to September 3rd. And in 1988, Jackson purchased the property that would become the physical manifestation of his inner world, Neverland Valley Ranch. It's at an approximately 2,700 acres in the Santa Ynez Valley near Los Olivos, California, with rolling golden hills studded with oak trees, an hour and a half northeast of Los Angeles. And the purchase price was somewhere between $17 and $5 million, depending on the source. The main residence was roughly 12,600 square feet, but the house was almost beside the point, because what Jackson built around it was something between a private theme park and a living fairy tale. A Ferris wheel, a carousel, a miniature railroad, a zoo with giraffes and elephants and chimpanzees, a movie theater, gardens, just anything and everything, you name it, that you would have wanted to see as a kid. It was theirs. And he named it after the island in Peter Pan where children never grow up. And the symbolism was not subtle, as Jackson identified with Peter Pan openly and repeatedly throughout his life. He said to me that he's Peter Pan, you know, and I feel that way too, and I guess we have the same feel about life, because he saw childhood as something sacred and something that had been stolen from him. And Neverland became Jackson's refuge, his creative workspace, and eventually the setting of the accusations that nearly destroyed him, because he would live there on and off for nearly 2 decades before the property became too painful to inhabit, and it would be sold in December of 2020, more than 11 years after his death, for $22 million. Now, the romantic relationships were few, intense, and brief, and Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley first crossed paths as children backstage at a Las Vegas concert in approximately 1974 or 1975, when she was about 7 and he was about 17. And her father was Elvis Presley, as we know, and his father was Joe Jackson. So they were, in a sense, the only 2 people on Earth who could fully understand each other's childhoods. and they would reconnect as adults in November 1992, when Jackson was in the earliest stages of his personal crisis that would soon become public. And their conversations grew frequent and intimate, and on May 26, 1994, 20 days after her divorce from musician Danny Keough was finalized, they married in a private ceremony in the Dominican Republic. And the world reacted with almost uniform disbelief, and the tabloids treated the marriage as a publicity stunt, a strategic alliance between two famous names designed to rehabilitate Jackson's image during the fallout from the 1993 allegations. And on September 8, 1994, at the MTV Video Music Awards, Jackson and Presley appeared on stage together, and he leaned over and kissed her. And the audience didn't know whether to cheer or cringe, and it remains one of the most analyzed public kisses in entertainment history. But whatever the marriage was, and Presley would later insist credibly, undemotionally, that it was real, it did not last, and they separated on December 10th, 1995, and Presley filed for divorce on January 18th, 1996, and it was finalized on August 20th, 1996. And in all her later accounts of the relationship, Presley described Jackson as deeply loving but also deeply troubled, consumed by prescription drugs and surrounded by enablers she couldn't penetrate. And she told Oprah Winfrey in 2010 that in one of their final conversations in 2005, Jackson had told her that someone was going to kill him for his music catalog gown this time. And she confirmed he gave her specific names, and she declined to share them for whatever reason. And the second marriage was different in almost every way. Miss Debbie Rowe was a nurse in Dr. Arnold Klein's dermatology office, and she and Jackson had known each other for years through Klein's practice. And on November 14th, 1996, less than 3 months after the Presley divorce was finalized, Jackson and Rowe married in Sydney, Australia. And she was 6 months pregnant, and their first child, Michael Joseph Jackson Jr., called Prince, was born on February 13, 1997, and their second, Paris Michael Catherine Jackson, was born on April 3, 1998. And the marriage appeared from outside, and arguably from the inside, to be primarily an arrangement for producing children. And Rowe would later describe the relationship in transcational terms, saying she had agreed to bear Jackson's children because she saw how much he wanted to be a father. But they would divorce at approximately April of 2000, with Rowe receiving an $8 million settlement and initially relinquishing custody. And Jackson's third child, Prince Michael Jackson II, originally called Blanket, later Big I, was born on February 21, 2002, via surrogate 2, and the identity of the surrogate and the biological mother has never been publicly confirmed. And on November 19, 2002, Jackson committed the single most damaging public relations act of his career that didn't involve a courtroom. Standing on the balcony of his suite at the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, he dangled the infant Blanket over the railing for stories above the street, while a crowd below screamed and cameras flashed. And the image circled the globe within hours, and Jackson later called it a terrible mistake. And obviously it was, but it was also a window into something the public was only beginning to reckon with, that the most famous man in the world was not functioning normally, that his judgment was eroding, and that whatever private reality he inhabited was drifting further and further from the one the rest of the world shared. So by the early 2000s, Michael Jackson was a father of 3, a 2-time divorcee, the owner of the most valuable music catalog in the world, and a man whose body was quietly failing, ravaged by vitiligo, lupus, surgical procedures, chronic insomnia, and a pharmaceutical dependency that no intervention had permanently resolved. And he was 44 years old, and he was still by any measure the most famous person alive. And the worst was yet to come. So in May of 1992, a woman named June Chandler and her 13-year-old son Jordan were stranded on the side of the road in Los Angeles. Their car had broken down, and they called Rent-A-Wreck for a replacement. And when it arrived, the employee who helped them recognized a name on the paperwork. One of their contacts was someone who worked with Michael Jackson. And through that thin thread of connection, June Chandler mentioned the encounter to the right person, who mentioned it to someone else, and within weeks the Chandler family had entered Michael Jackson's orbit. Now, Jackson took to Jordan, or Jordy, as the family called him, with an intensity that was by then recognizable to people around him. And he had a pattern of forming deeply close relationships with children, particularly boys around the age of 12 or 13. And he would call them constantly, invite them to Neverland, shower them and their families with gifts and access to his world. And he was generous to a degree that seemed almost compulsive. And to Jackson, these relationships were innocent, an attempt to experience the childhood he believed had been stolen from him, to live inside the uncomplicated joy of a child's companionship. To observers, they were at best unusual and at worst alarming. And the distance between those two interpretations would define the rest of Jackson's life. Now, Jordan Chandler's father was Evan Chandler, a Beverly Hills dentist who also worked as a screenwriter, with a co-writing credit on Mel Brooks' Robin Hood, Men in Tights. And Devon was not part of the initial connection because June had primary custody, and it was through her that Jackson and Jordan spent increasing amounts of time together. But Evan Chandler grew suspicious of the relationship, then angry, then something harder to categorize. So, on July 8th, 1993, Evan Chandler was recorded in a phone conversation saying, quote, "If I go through with this, I win big time. I will get everything I want and they will be told they will be destroyed forever." And the statement would become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the case. As to Jackson defenders, it was proof that the allegations were financially motivated from the start, a shakedown dressed as child protection. And to those who believed the accusations, it was a father's anguished calculation about the legal system's leverage, not evidence that the underlying claims were false. Both readings are sustainable, but neither are definitive. And on August 17th, 1993, the allegations were formally reported to authorities, and Jordan Chandler described acts of assault by Jackson. And the Los Angeles Police Department and the Department of Children and Family Services opened investigations. And the story detonated across the global media with a force that made every previous Jackson Abloyd saga look quaint. And on December 20th, 1993, Jackson submitted to a strip search a body examination conducted by investigators, seeking to determine whether Jordan Chandler's description of Jackson's anatomy matched reality. And Jackson described the experience as the most humiliating event of his life. And the results of the examination have been the subject of conflicting interpretations ever since, because Jackson's camp maintained the descriptions did not match, and the prosecution's position was more ambiguous too. And a grand juries were convened, one in Los Angeles and one in Santa Barbara. Over 13 months, more than 400 witnesses were interviewed, and neither grand jury returned an indictment. So without an indictment, there could be no criminal trial. And on January 25th, 1994, a civil settlement was reached, and the amount was approximately $23 million. And Jackson's insurance carrier paid the claim, and Jackson's legal team maintained, and Jackson himself would insist for the rest of his life that the settlement was not an admission of guilt, but a strategic decision to end a situation that was destroying him personally and professionally at the recommendation of his attorneys and over his own objections. And his critics argued that innocent men don't pay $23 million. And his defenders countered that innocent men who are the most famous person on earth and hemorrhaging millions of dollars per week in canceled deals and destroyed partnerships sometimes do. And the settlement did not include a confidentiality clause preventing the Chandlers from cooperating with criminal authorities. And Jordan Chandler and his family chose not to pursue criminal charges, so the investigation was closed. And Evan Chandler died by, you know what, on November 5th, 2009, less than 5 months after Michael Jackson's death. That is a bit suspicious. A bit? Why would you do that? Seems like out of guilt, but what do I know? And at that point, he had been estranged from his son Jordan for years, and his death was reported quietly, a footnote in a larger story that had already moved on. So for nearly a decade after the settlement, Jackson lived under a cloud that never fully dissipated. And the allegations had not been proven. They had not been disproven either. and they existed in a permanent state of suspicion, following him into every room, coloring every interaction, inflecting every headline. And his record sales would decline, and his public image curdled, and the jokes became cruel and ubiquitous. And he retreated further into Neverland, further into isolation, and further into the company of children and the animals and amusement park rides that constituted his version of a normal life. And then in February of 2003, a British journalist named Martin Bashir aired a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson. And Bashir had spent 8 months with Jackson, gaining extraordinary access to his daily life at Neverland. And the documentary included a scene in which Jackson held hands with a 13-year-old boy named Gavin Vizo, a child cancer patient Jackson had befriended in 2000 and said on camera, "But is it really appropriate for a 44-year-old man to share a bedroom with a child who is not related to him at all? That's a beautiful thing, that's not a worrying thing. Why should it be worrying?" And he meant it innocently, but unfortunately, it did not land innocently. And the documentary was watched by an estimated 14.6 million viewers in the UK and 22 million in the US. And the reaction was immediate and devastating. And Gavin Vizo's family subsequently alleged that Jackson had molested the boy. So on November 18th, 2003, approximately 70 sheriff's deputies raided Neverland Ranch, and 2 days later, on November 20th, Jackson turned himself into Santa Barbara County authorities, and he was arrested, handcuffed, photographed, and released on $3 million bail. And the booking photo, his expression somewhere between defiance and dissociation, was broadcast on every television screen in the world. And he later said the arrest was deliberately humiliating, that he was handcuffed so tightly his wrists bled, that he was locked in a restroom smeared with feces, and that the officers laughed. And Santa Barbara authorities denied the claims fully. But the truth of what happened in those hours between surrender and release has never been independently established. But the charges were severe. In December of 2003, the initial indictment included 7 counts of child molestation, 2 counts of administering an intoxicating agent to a minor, and 1 count of conspiracy. But by April 2004, the indictment had been restructured for counts of molesting a minor, for counts of intoxicating a minor with alcohol, and 1 count of attempted molestation, and 1 count of conspiracy, and 10 charges that would expand to 14 at verdict when lesser included offenses were added. So if convicted on all counts, Jackson faced decades in prison. So the trial, People v. Jackson, began with jury selection on January 31st, 2005 in Santa Maria, California before Judge Rodney Melville. And opening arguments commenced on February 28th. And the prosecution, led by District Attorney Tom Sneddon, who had investigated Jackson during the 1993 case as well, and whose pursuit of Jackson struck many observers as personal, presented its case over several months. And approximately 140 witnesses were called, and the defense dismantled the prosecution's case methodically. Gavin Vizo's mother, Janet, was shown to have a history of making false claims, including welfare fraud and a prior false accusation of assault against a Chepney security guard. And the timeline of the alleged abuse was problematic, and the prosecution claimed this abuse occurred after the Bashir documentary aired, meaning Jackson had supposedly chosen to abuse a child immediately after the entire world had been put on alert about his relationships with children. And the family had continued to voluntarily visit Neverland and accept Jackson's hospitality throughout the period in question, which was odd though. And Macaulay Culkin, the former child star of Home Alone, who had been one of Jackson's closest childhood companions and who the prosecution hoped to establish as a prior victim, took the stand and testified unequivocally that he had never been abused by Jackson. And Wade Robson, an Australian choreographer who had known Jackson since childhood, also testified that he had never been abused, but Robson would reverse his position in 2013, filing a civil claim alleging years of abuse. But on the witness stand in 2005, under oath, he said it never happened. And on June 13th, 2005, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty on all 14 counts, and it was unanimous. And Jackson was in the courtroom when the verdicts were read, and he showed little visible emotion. And outside the courthouse, thousands of fans who had maintained a vigil throughout the trial erupted. And inside, according to people who were with him, Jackson was hollowed out. The acquittal was total, the vindication was complete, but it didn't matter. The trial had consumed nearly 2 years of his life, cost tens of millions of dollars, and left him physically and psychologically destroyed. And he had entered the courtroom weighing, by some accounts, less than 120 pounds because he had been unable to eat and he had been unable to sleep, or rather, he had been unable to sleep without propofol, and the demands of daily court appearances had disrupted even that pharmaceutical oblivion. So after the verdict, Michael Jackson left the courthouse, left Santa Maria, and effectively left the United States. And he would spend most of the next 2.5 years abroad, in Bahrain and Ireland. In various rented properties scattered across the world, a man acquitted of everything and unable to return to normal life. Neverland, the place he had built as a sanctuary, had been raided and violated and publicized in every tabloid on earth, so he felt like he couldn't go back, and he would never live there again. And the allegations from 1993 and 2005, the settlement and the acquittal, became the defining lens through which Michael Jackson would be viewed for the rest of his life and beyond. Not the music, not the dancing, not the record sales or the moonwalk, or the transformation of pop culture. The question, the unresolvable, unanswerable, permanent question that followed him out of the courtroom, across the ocean, into exile. And it was still following him 3.5 years later, in the summer of 2009, when he agreed to perform 50 concerts in London and began rehearsing for a comeback he would not survive. So after the acquittal, Michael Jackson did what any person might do if they had been publicly accused of the worst crimes imaginable, dragged through a 5-month trial broadcast to the world, and found not guilty on every count he ran. And in June 2005, Jackson left the United States for Bahrain, a small island kingdom in the Persian Gulf, the personal guest of Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, a son of the king. That was a mouthful. And the Sheikh provided Jackson with a residence, staff, security, and a loan of $2 million to cover outstanding legal fees from the trial. And the arrangement was for a time a genuine refuge, and he stayed nearly a year, from June 2005 to May 2006, before the relationship with the Sheikh kind of soured. And Abdullah later sued Jackson for approximately $7 million, claiming Jackson had failed to honor commitments related to a planned album and autobiography. And after Bahrain, Jackson drifted to Ireland for several months, then to various rented properties in the United States and Europe. But he was a man without a fixed address, without a clear plan, and without financial stability. And by this point, Jackson's debt had reached approximately $500 million. That number is almost incomprehensible until you understand its architecture. There's decades of lavish spending on Neverland's upkeep, the zoo, the staff taff. The constant travel, the legal defense costs from 2 sets of allegations, the entourage, the mansions, his shopping, all layered on top of hundreds of millions borrowed against his share of the Sony 80 Vic at a log at punishing interest rates. He was one of the wealthiest people alive on paper and functionally insolvent in practice. And the catalog, worth billions, was also his only lifeline, the collateral that kept the creditors at bay, and if the loans defaulted, he could lose everything. So it was into this desperation that the concert deal arrived, and in late 2008, a mysterious figure entered Jackson's life, or rather re-entered it, and that was Thome. Now Thome, a man with a deliberately obscured background who represented himself variously as a doctorate orthopedic surgeon, a PhD in economics, and an ambassador at large for Senegal, none of which was true, had been introduced to Jackson through Germain. Now Thome, working as a consultant for Colony Capital, connected Jackson to Colony's chairman Tom Barrick, who connected him to Philip Hanchitz, the billionaire owner of AEG Live, the world's second-largest concert promoter. A deal began to take shape. And on March 5, 2009, Jackson appeared at the O2 Arena in London to make the announcement. And between 3,000 and 7,000 fans were waiting. Accounts vary. with AEG's own CEO Randy Phillips testifying under oath to the lower number, and 350 journalists had been credentialed. And Jackson arrived 90 minutes late, and when he finally took stage, he looked thin, he looked fragile. And he told the crowd this would be it, the final curtain call, this is it. And he said, this is it, this is it, this is really it, this is the final curtain call. And the name stuck. And the concerts would be held at the O2 Arena starting that July. And Jackson had agreed to 10 shows, and within days, AEG expanded the commitment to 50. Roughly 750,000 tickets were sold, generating approximately $85 million in revenue before a single note was performed. And AEG had advanced Jackson close to $30 million in production costs, loans, and living expenses, including $100,000 per month for a mansion and home by Hills and a $15 million line of credit. The financial exposure was enormous for both sides. And for AEG, a successful run could generate hundreds of millions, and a global tour beyond London was projected at $450 million or more. And for Jackson, the concerts represented a path out of debt or, if he couldn't perform, total financial annihilation. Behind the scenes, things were going badly from the start. Randy Phillips, AEG CEO, sent an email before the March 5th announcement describing Jackson as locked in his room, drunk and despondent. And Phillips later testified that he had screamed at Jackson to get him out of the room and had slapped him on the butt to motivate him. And Phillips and Jackson's manager, Frank Delio, had to physically help dress him. And the man who walked on stage and told the world he was ready for his comeback had to be coerced into putting on his clothes. And the rehearsals began in the spring of 2009 at the Staples Center in the Forum in Inglewood. And on good days, Jackson was brilliant. Dancers and musicians who worked with him during this period described flashes of the old magic, moments where his movement and vocal power were fully intact, where you could see the greatest performer of his generation still living inside the increasingly fragile body. And on bad days, he was incoherent. He was cold when the room was warm. He trembled. He couldn't remember choreography he had performed thousands of times, and he was losing weight constantly, and he was not sleeping. And on June 19, 2009, 6 days before his death, the show's director, Kenny Ortega, sent an email to Randy Phillips with a subject line, "Trouble at the Front." And Ortega described finding Jackson, quote-unquote, lost and incoherent at rehearsal, cold to touch, trembling, unable to perform. And he had wrapped Jackson in blankets and tried to feed him. There are strong signs of paranoia, anxiety, and obsessive-like behavior, Ortega would write. And I think the very best thing we can do is get a top psychiatrist in to evaluate him ASAP. So Elif Sankey, an associate producer on the show, was more blunt, saying, quote-unquote, Michael is dying. She told colleagues, and quote-unquote, he needs to be put in a hospital. And Phillips' response shut Ortega down, saying, quote, it is critical that neither you, me, or anyone become amateur psychiatrists or physicians. He would write, and Phillips described Jackson's personal physician, a cardiologist named Conrad Murray, as quote-unquote extremely successful and totally unbiased and ethical, and he instructed Ortega to defer to Murray's medical judgment. So Dr. Conrad Murray, born February 19, 1953, in Grenada, board-eligible but not board-certified in cardiology, internal medicine certification lapsed and no training in anesthesiology, sleep medicine, or pain management. Over $400,000 in court judgments, a $2,000 to bankruptcy, defaulted on his $166 million mortgage, child support arrears for children by multiple women. A Las Vegas clinic facing eviction was about to treat Michael Jackson. Now, he had first met Michael Jackson in December of 2006 through Jackson's children, and by 2009 Jackson had requested that Murray serve as his personal physician for the London concerts. And AEG agreed to pay Murray $150,000 per month, a salary Murray had negotiated down from his initial ask of $5 million per year. He's not even qualified. And the contract contained a provision that gave AEG the power to terminate the agreement if concerts were postponed or canceled. creating what experts would later describe as an egregious conflict of interest. The doctor's income depended on the patient performing. Very bad. And already an unqualified, greedy bastard is now reading Michael Jackson. It's just a nightmare that is about to unfold. But no background check was conducted. An employment expert later testified that a $10 search would have revealed Murray's financial desperation. Murray was administering propofol to Jackson nightly in a bedroom, not a hospital, and he had no pulse oximeter monitoring Jackson's oxygen levels, and he had no capnography equipment to measure exhaled carbon dioxide either. And the oxygen tank in the room was empty, and the pulse oximeter was still in its box, unopened. But he was putting a man under general anesthesia every night with no monitoring equipment and no emergency protocols at a rented mansion in Home by Hills, so that the most famous entertainer in history could approximate something that resembled sleep. Absolutely abhorrent. So on the evening of June 24th, 2009, Michael Jackson arrived at the Staples Center for what would be his final rehearsal, and he got there around 6:30 p.m. and worked until approximately 12. On June 25th. And footage from that night, later released as part of the This Is It documentary, shows Jackson performing Earth Song with full commitment, hitting his marks, directing the band. It was one of the good nights. And those who saw him said he looked like Michael Jackson again. And his personal chef, Kai Chase, prepared his dinner. And Jackson ate, then retired to his bedroom on the second floor of Home by Hills Mansion at 100 North Carroll with Dr. Wood. And Dr. Conrad Murray was with him. And what happened in that bedroom over the next 14 hours is known primarily through Murray's own account, given to police, contested by prosecutors, and never subjected to cross-examination, because Murray chose not to testify at either his criminal trial or the AEG wrongful death trial. And according to Murray, Jackson was agitated and unable to sleep, so Murray began administering a sequence of sedatives, escalating through the night as each one failed to produce unconsciousness. So at 1, 0 a.m., 10 milligrams of diazepam or Valium intravenously, and at 2, 0 a.m., 2 mg of lorazepam or Ativan administered intravenously, and at 3, 0 a.m., 2 mg of midazolam mort or versed administered intravenously, and at 5, 0 a.m., 2 mg of lorazepam again, and at 7, 0 a.m., 2 milligrams of midazolam mort again. But none of it worked, and for 6 hours, Murray pumped Jackson full of benzodiazepines, and Jackson remained awake, his body so conditioned to sedation, so profoundly broken in its ability to achieve natural sleep that clinical doses of multiple tranquilizers could not bring him down. And according to Murray, Jackson begged for propofol throughout the night, and Murray claimed he resisted, and he claimed he was trying to wean Jackson off the drug on this time. And at approximately 10:00 a.m., Murray administered 25 milligrams of propofol, a dose he described as small, diluted in a lidocaine drip. And by about 10:40 a.m., Jackson was unconscious, and Murray said he then monitored Jackson for approximately 10 minutes, and around 11. I left the room for about 2 minutes, he claimed, and when he returned, Michael Jackson was not breathing. But the phone records tell a different story about those minutes. Beginning at 11:07 a.m., Murray made 3 phone calls, a 30-minute call to his Las Vegas office, a 3-minute call to a patient, and an 11-minute call to a Houston colleague. So 47 minutes on the phone. During this time, by his account, his patient was unconscious under propofol with no monitoring equipment. And what happened between approximately 11:00 a.m. and 12:17 p.m., when bodyguard Alberto Alvarez arrived at the bedroom and found Murray performing what appeared to be CPR on the bed, is a gap that has never been fully explained. And Alvarez later testified that when he entered the room, Murray was frantic. And according to Alvarez, Murray grabbed vials from a nightstand and ordered Alvarez to put them in a bag, and Murray then had Alvarez remove an IV bag containing a milky white substance, the color of propofol. And only after these items were concealed, Alvarez testified, did Murray direct him to call 911. And it should be noted that Alvarez made no mention of the vial concealing in his first police interview on June 25th. The account emerged on August 31st after Jackson's cause of death had been made public. And the 911 call was placed at 12:21 p.m., and Alvarez told the dispatcher that a 50-year-old man, he said 50, Jackson was in fact 50, had stopped breathing. We have a gentleman here that needs help, and he's not breathing yet. He's not breathing and we need to. We're trying to pump him, but he's not okay. And the dispatcher asked if the patient was on a bed, and he was, and the dispatcher told them to move him to the floor for CPR. And this had not been done, and Murray had been performing chest compressions on a mattress, which, he should know if he's a doctor, absorbs the force and renders CPR largely ineffective. Paramedics arrived at 12:26 p.m. and they found Jackson on the bed, and he had been moved to the floor briefly, then returned with an IV in his left leg, his body cool to the touch and his pupils fixed and dilated. And paramedic Richard Sen Neff estimated, based on Jackson's condition, that at least 20 minutes had elapsed since cardiac arrest because Michael Jackson's extremities were beginning to turn blue. And Murray did not tell the paramedics that he had administered propofol, and he did not tell the emergency room doctors at Ukla Medical Center either. And he would never voluntarily disclose the propofol. And the paramedics worked on Jackson at the house and then during transport. And the ambulance left the Carrollwood mansion at 1:07 p.m. and arrived at Ukla Ronald Reagan Medical Center at approximately 1:14 p.m. And emergency physicians continued resuscitation efforts for over an hour. And at 2:26 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time on June 25, 2009, Michael Joseph Jackson was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. And at 2:44 p.m., 18 minutes after the pronouncement, TMZ published the news. And the story broke not through a hospital statement or a family announcement or a press conference, but through a celebrity gossip website, because that was the world Michael Jackson had lived and died in. And within minutes, the internet buckled, and Google servers registered such a massive spike in search traffic that the company's automated systems interpreted it as a distributed denial of service attack, and Twitter crashed, and Wikipedia crashed. And 15% of all Twitter posts in the hour that followed mentioned Michael Jackson. The servers couldn't hold the grief, and I, like I'm sure many, remember this day, and it is cemented in my brain. It is what a horribly, horribly tragic day. So the Los Angeles County Coroner's autopsy, performed the following day, established the cause of death as acute propofol intoxication with a contributory benzodiazepine effect, meaning the propofol killed him. And the cascade of sedatives Murray had administered throughout the night made the lethal dose more lethal. And the manner of death was ruled a homicide. The autopsy revealed a body that told the story of its occupant's life. Jackson stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 136 pounds. His skin showed the depigmentation pattern of vitiligo, confirming the diagnosis he had disclosed 16 years earlier on Oprah's couch. The condition the tabloids had spent decades insisting was voluntary skin bleaching. His heart was healthy, his major organs were functional. There was no cancer, no terminal illness, no underlying condition that would have killed him. Without the propofol, Michael Jackson's body could have continued living. It was not the body that failed. It was the people around his body. So Conrad Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter on February 8, 2010, 8 months after Jackson's death, not murder, not even second-degree murder, which the LAPD detectives who investigated the case believed the evidence warranted. Lead detectives Orlando Martinez, Dan Myers, and Scott Smith would later state in a 2019 documentary called Killing Michael Jackson that they had pushed for a second-degree murder charge, but the district attorney's office opted for manslaughter. And the trial lasted 6 weeks from September 27th to November 7th, 2011, and the prosecution's case was straightforward. Murray had administered a powerful surgical anesthetic in a home setting without appropriate monitoring equipment, had failed to call 911 promptly, had attempted to conceal evidence, and had never disclosed the propofol to emergency medical personnel. And the defense argued that Jackson had self-administered additional propofol when Murray left the room, an accidental overdose by a desperate addict, not criminal negligence by a doctor. Dr. fucking. Not a doctor at all. And Murray did not take the stand. And on November 7, 2011, the jury found Conrad Murray guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 4 years in county jail. 4 years. That was the maximum for the charge. And due to California's overcrowding provisions, he served approximately 2 years before being released on October 28, 2013. And he later published a memoir titled This Is It, positioning himself as a scapegoat. And he never expressed remorse for Jackson's death, even though it was completely his fault. And then the second trial was civil. Catherine Jackson, Michael's mother, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Tae-E-G Liv, seeking between $1.5 and $2 billion in damages. And the case Catherine Jackson vs. Tae-E-G Liv was the longer and in many ways more revealing proceeding, lasting 5 months with 58 witnesses. And the central question was whether IEG had hired, controlled, or supervised Murray, and whether they bore a responsibility for placing a financially desperate, unqualified doctor in charge of Jackson's care. And the evidence that emerged was damning in texture, if not in legal outcome. And Tae-E-G's own emails showed executives who knew Jackson was deteriorating unpushed forward anyway. And Paul Gongware, Tae-E-G's co-CEO, had written of Murray, quote, "We want to remind him that it is Tae-E-G, not Michael Jackson, who is paying his salary. We want him to understand what is expected of him," unquote. No background check had been conducted. The contract gave Tae-E-G termination power over Murray's compensation if shows were postponed, meaning the doctor's paycheck depended on his patient performing, as we said before. And Kenny Ortega's trouble at the Fernie Mail, describing Jackson as lost and incoherent 6 days before his death, had been answered with Phillips' instructions to stop playing amateur doctor and defer to Murray. And Prince Jackson, Michael's eldest son, 15 years old at the time, testified that his father had told him in tears after phone calls with Tae-E-G executives, quote-unquote, "They're going to kill me, they're going to kill me," and he named Randy Phillips and Tom Thome specifically. And on October 2nd, 2013, the jury delivered its verdict, and they found unanimously that Tae-E-G Liv had indeed hired Conrad Murray. But they also found that Murray was not unfit or incompetent for the job, a conclusion that struck many observers as difficult to reconcile with the facts. Because the jury answered no to the competence question, Tae-E-G was found not liable. The case was over. And the jury foreman later told reporters, quote, "Had the question been was Murray ethical, it could have been a different outcome," unquote. Just unbelievable, in my opinion. And Catherine Jackson's appeal was rejected by the California Court of Appeals in 2015. And after Jackson's death, Randy Phillips wrote in an email, quote, "Tae-E-G will make a fortune from merch sales, ticket retention, the touring exhibition, and the film DVD," unquote. And unfortunately, he was right. IEG recouped its losses and then some through merchandise, through the 40 to 50% of ticket holders who kept their tickets as souvenirs rather than requesting refunds, and through a 10% stake in This Is It, the concert rehearsal documentary assembled from footage of Jackson's final rehearsals. And the film grossed $267 million worldwide, and it showed Michael Jackson dancing, singing, directing, alive, electric, unmistakably brilliant. The last footage of the greatest performer who ever lived, packaged and sold to the world by the company his son said was going to kill him. So the Los Angeles County Coroner ruled the manner of Michael Jackson's death as a homicide, as we know, and Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, a charge that lead the LAPD detectives on the case believed should have been second-degree murder. And the official cause was acute propofol intoxication administered by a doctor who should have never been in that bedroom. So for the legal system, the story ends there, but for Jackson's family and for a substantial number of people who have examined the documented evidence, including myself, it does not. And Michael Jackson spent the last years of his life telling the people closest to him that he was going to be killed. And his son Prince, who testified under oath at the Tae-E-G trial in 2013, quote, After he got off the phone, he would cry. He would say, "They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me." End quote. And he named specific people, AEG's Randy Phillips and his former manager Thom Thome. And he told Lisa Marie Presley during one of their final conversations in 2005 that someone was going to kill him for his music catalog guard. And she confirmed on Oprah in 2010 that he gave her names, but as we said before, she declined to share them. And he told his sister LaToya, quote, "I'm going to be murdered for my music publishing catalog in my estate." End quote. You've been quoted as saying you believe he may have been murdered. Do you still think that? Absolutely. Why? I should never, ever think differently. And he told his daughter Paris, who recalled in a 2017 Rolling Stone interview, quote, he would drop hints about people out to get him. And at some point, he was like, "They're going to kill me one day." End quote. And handwritten notes attributed to Jackson, shared by a friend and published in 2017, read, quote, "They are trying to murder me and the system wants to kill me for my catalog." End quote. And his bodyguards, Bill Whitfield and Javin Beard, wrote in their 2014 memoir that Jackson's primary security concern was not fans or strangers, but, quote, "the people who were already in his life. He wanted us there so he could hide his movements from his own lawyers and managers." Unquote. And the identity of they shifted over time. AEG executives, Sony, Tommy Mottola, unnamed catalog seekers, the system. And the warnings were consistent, and the question is what they mean: prophetic awareness of a genuine conspiracy, or the escalating paranoia of a man whose brain was being ravaged by nightly propofol and regular Demerol injections, substances known to exacerbate anxiety and disordered thinking. And the honest answer is that both could be true simultaneously. And what follows are the major theories presented with the evidence that supports them and the evidence that complicates them. And I want to put a disclaimer that none of these have been proven, but also that none can be entirely dismissed. And the broadest and most legally tested theory holds that AEG Live knowingly pushed a deteriorating Jackson beyond his limits to protect a roughly $30 million investment while hiring a financially desperate doctor they could control. The evidence is substantial because AEG expanded Jackson's commitment from 10 shows to 50 within days of the announcement, despite handwritten notes attributed to Jackson reading, quote, "only agreed to 10 shows," end quote. And their own CEO described Jackson as, quote, "locked in his room, drunk and despondent," unquote, before the press conference. Another co-CEO wrote of Murray, quote, "We want to remind him that it is AEG, not Michael Jackson, who is paying his salary," unquote. And when Kenny Ortega warned 6 days before Jackson's death that the former was lost and incoherent and needed a psychiatrist, Randy Phillips told him to stop playing amateur doctor. No background check was conducted on Murray. The contract tied Murray's compensation to the concert's proceedings, and so on. We know this. We know all the information regarding the AEG theory. But after the trial, the jury, while unanimously finding that AEG had hired Murray, concluded he was not unfit or incompetent and therefore AEG bore no liability. But the counter-argument is real. A living Jackson touring globally over 3 years was projected to generate $450 million or more. And AEG also dropped its own $17.5 million insurance claim with Lloyd's of London in 2012. Not exactly the behavior of a company that planned a death for profit. I personally think, and you guys can sound off all of what you think in the comments, but I feel like it was in their interest to have Michael actually do those concerts. Did they use and abuse him horrifically? And did that lead to his death? Absolutely. But I don't think that was planned, but they were absolutely a giant part of him passing away. And next, there is the catalog theory. And this is the theory Jackson himself most explicitly articulated because his 50% stake in the Sony ADV catalog grew. Purchased in 1985 for $47.5 million, was worth approximately $1 billion by 2009 and $4 billion by 2016, making him one of the most valuable targets in the entertainment industry. And he had publicly declared war on Sony in July 2002, calling CEO Tommy Mottola a racist and very very devilish at Al Sharpton's National Action Network in Harlem, and he accused Sony of sabotaging his album Invincible to force a catalog sale. And by 2009, Jackson had borrowed between $270 and $380 million against his catalog share, held by Fortress Investment Group at 16.8% annual interest, because a default could trigger a forced sale, and Sony held a first right of refusal. So what happened after his death is the theory's most powerful exhibit. So in 2016, Sony bought the estate's 50% of Sony ADV for $750 million. And in 2018, Sony paid $287.5 million for the estate's share of EM on music publishing. And in 2024, Sony purchased 50% of Jackson's Me Jack music catalog for over $600 million. Total payments from Sony to the estate now exceed $2 billion. So Sony owns the catalog Jackson's were he would never sell. That's the basis of all of this. So that doesn't look good. Looks like they were constantly waiting to prey upon this sale. But the counter-argument would be that Sony could have acquired the catalog through legal financial pressure, and Jackson's mounting debt had a forced sale plausible without violence, and no law enforcement investigation found evidence of a catalog-motivated conspiracy, and Murray's conviction established purposeful negligence, not corporate assassination. Now, a narrower version of the conspiracy asks not whether Jackson was murdered by a corporation or a cabal, but whether Murray was specifically selected or allowed to remain because his financial desperation made him controllable and his lack of qualifications made Jackson's death inevitable. Now to go over Murray again, he owed over $1 million. He had defaulted on a $166 million mortgage, and he had $600,000 in court judgments. And he had $71,000 in student loans, child support for children by 6 or 7 women, and a $2,000 to bankruptcy, and his Las Vegas clinic was being evicted. And he initially asked, as we know, AEG for $5 million per year before accepting $150,000 per month. And LAPD Detective Orlando Martinez testified that Murray's financial situation was a major incentive to break the rules, and his qualifications were grossly inadequate for what he was doing. Not board certified in cardiology, internal medicine certification lapsed, no training in anesthesiology or sleep medicine, suspended from hospitals 3 times. And he administered propofol nightly in a bedroom with no pulse oximeter, no capnography, and an empty oxygen tank. And the timeline on June 25th raises its own questions. 47 minutes of phone calls while his patient lay unconscious, a gap of over an hour before 911 was called, and bodyguard testimony about concealing vials before summoning help. Murray never told paramedics or emergency physicians that he had administered propofol, and Paris Jackson was direct, saying, quote, absolutely, because it's obvious, all arrows point to that, end quote. And she used scare quotes around the word doctor when discussing Murray, which yeah. And the LAPD detectives who built the case believed the evidence warranted a second-degree murder charge. But as we're doing for all the other theories, there's the counter-argument, and that is that Murray, the fucking idiot that he is, panicked, had a chaotic response that looked more like incompetence than execution, and if he had been hired to kill, the execution would presumably have been more professional. And Jackson actively sought propofol, multiple doctors before Murray had refused his requests. So I don't know, I would love to know what you guys think down below. And the next one is that Jackson was approximately $500 million in debt at the time of his death, and his estate has since generated roughly $5 billion. And Joe Jackson said it publicly, saying, quote, he's worth more dead than he was alive, end quote. And the IRS argued the same point during tax proceedings. And Forbes named Jackson the top earning dead celebrity in nearly every year since 2009, peaking at $825 million in 2016. And This Is It documentary grossed $267 million. And the Cirque du Soleil residency generated over $160 million. And the Broadway musical grossed approximately $300 million. And the estate cleared All $500 million in debt is currently valued at $5 billion. And the counter-argument is just timing, because this success was not foreseeable in 2009. And a living Jackson completing a 3-year global tour was the most immediately profitable scenario for everyone involved. And the worth more dead than alive observation is retrospective, powerful as rhetoric, but weak as evidence of any premeditation. And then there's Dr. Arnold Klein. Now, Dr. Arnold Klein, Jackson's longtime Beverly Hills dermatologist, administered over 200 Demerol injections across decades, with records kept under the alias Somer Arnold. And in the 4 months before Jackson's death, the doses escalated dramatically: 375 mg in 3 hours on April 22, 2009, and 900 mg over 3 days in May, and 900 mg over 3 days. And his last appointment was June 22nd, 3 days before death, when he received 100 mg. A typical anxiety dose is 50 mg, just so you know. Murray's defense argued the chain explicitly, that Klein's Demerol created dependency. Withdrawal caused insomnia. Insomnia drove propofol use, and propofol killed him. And Demerol's short half-life meant none appeared in the autopsy, but withdrawal symptoms from the June 22nd injection would have been active on June 25th. So Klein was investigated by the DN, the California Medical Board, but never charged, and he filed for bankruptcy in 2011 and died in 2015 at the age of 70. And the mainstream interpretation is that Klein was an enabler in a system of medical exploitation, not a conspirator, but a link in the chain that killed Michael Jackson nonetheless. Now, the most enigmatic figure in Jackson's final years was his manager, Tom, a man who represented himself as a Lebanese doctor, orthopedic surgeon, PhD in economics, and ambassador at large for Senegal. But under cross-examination at an IRS tax trial, he admitted he had never attended medical school and did not hold a PhD. And the Senegalese embassy confirmed he was not their ambassador. So Tom entered Jackson's life in late 2007 through Jermaine Jackson, working as a consultant for Colony Capital at $20,000 per month. And he connected Jackson to Colony's Tom Barrack, who connected him to AEG's Philip Panchertz. And Tom negotiated the This Is It deal, and his financial arrangements were extraordinarily favorable: a $35,000 monthly management fee, 15% commission on all Jackson's earnings, which is crazy, and $100,000 per month as a concert producer, and a $3 million finder's fee for a Neverland loan, and 10% of any future Neverland sale. But Jackson fired Tom on May 5, 2009, 7 weeks before his death. And Tom reportedly responded with rage, threatening to bring death and destruction on Michael Jackson. Despite being fired, Tom denied his termination, continued identifying himself as Jackson's manager, and on the day of Jackson's death, spoke as his representative at UCLA Medical Center. Just a scum-of-the-earth piece of shit. And a taped conversation from September 2008 captures Jackson's own unease, saying, quote, "This guy has ways about him. There's a divide between me and my representatives, and I don't talk to my lawyer, my accountant." End quote. And Prince Jackson named Tom by name in his sworn testimony. Then the estate later sued Tom for financial exploitation, and the case settled in 2019 for $3 million. And the counter-argument is basically that Tom was not at that mansion on June 25th, and there is no actual tangible evidence that connects him to the propofol administration. And the lawsuit alleged financial exploitation, not necessarily murder. And beyond the major theories lie smaller, less substantiated claims. 5 of the Jackson siblings alleged in 2012 that his July 7, 2002 will was forged, claiming he was in New York City at an Al Sharpton event on the date it was supposedly signed in Los Angeles. And the legal challenges were rejected by every court that heard them, from La Supreme Court through the California Supreme Court. Jackson's entertainment attorney, Peter Lopez, was found dead from a gunshot wound on April 30th, 2010, less than a year after Jackson's death, ruled an apparent you-know-what. And conspiracy theorists noted a cluster of connected deaths in the months after Jackson's. Evan Chandler had died by you-know-what in November of 2009, and Bruce W. Dine, a former Klein employee, in December of 2009, and Lopez. And Canadian journalist Tian Halperin predicted in December of 2008, 6 months before the death, that Jackson had 6 months to live. And his conclusion was, quote, "Greed killed Michael Jackson," unquote. But no court and no law enforcement investigation and no credible journalistic inquiry has established that Michael Jackson was deliberately murdered as part of a conspiracy. The official cause of death is acute propofol intoxication due to criminally negligent care by a doctor who was convicted and served 2 years, which is garbage in my opinion. And a 5-month civil trial found EEG not liable. Yet the documented record provides substantial material for those who believe the story is incomplete. And Jackson repeatedly warned he would be killed, naming specific individuals in his son's sworn testimony. But the coroner ruled the manner of death a homicide, and Katherine Jackson would say in 2011, quote, "If such evidence ever comes to my attention, I will be the first to bring those facts to light," unquote. But the evidence still has not arrived. But the questions have not gone away. And on July 7th of 2009, 12 days after his death, Michael Jackson was memorialized at the Staples Center in Los Angeles. And 17,500 tickets were distributed by lottery from a pool of over 1 million applicants. And an estimated 5 billion people watched globally, though that figure is essentially unverifiable. And Stevie Wonder performed, and Mariah Carey performed, and Usher approached the open casket and broke down. And Jennifer Hudson sang "Will You Be There?" and Smokey Robinson read from the Bible. And Brooke Shields, one of Jackson's closest friends, described the boy she had known since they were both teenagers, 2 of the most famous children in the world finding refuge in each other's company. And Berry Gordy, the man who had signed the Jackson 5 for decades earlier, called him the greatest entertainer that ever lived. And Reverend Al Sharpton addressed Jackson's 3 children directly. "Was it nothing strange about your daddy? It was strange what your daddy had to deal with." And the moment that silenced the arena came at the end, when Paris Jackson, 11 years old, stepped to the microphone. "Ever since I was born, Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine. And I just wanted to say I love him, so much to say I love him so much." And she could not finish, so Janet Jackson held her on this turn. And Michael Jackson would then be buried on September 3rd, 2009 at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, and entombed in the Holly Terrace section of the Great Mausoleum, so he would forever be remembered as the greatest performer who ever lived. But those questions are still being asked to this day, mostly in why did he actually die, because it's hard to even accept what came to be. And for a while, it seemed like the story might end there with the gold casket, the tearful daughter, the billion-dollar estate slowly paying off a dead man's debts. The world moved on the way it always does. Jokes faded, and the music came back on the radio, and the conspiracy theories settled into the corners of the internet where conspiracy theories live. So it seemed Michael Jackson finally was being allowed to rest until a decade later. So a decade after Jackson's death, the allegations would return. And on January 25th, 2019, the documentary Leaving Neverland premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, directed by Dan Reed. And the 4-hour film featured 2 men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, describing in graphic detail what they said were years of saw by Jackson during their childhoods. And Robson was the same choreographer who had testified under oath at Jackson's 2005 criminal trial that he had never been abused, and he reversed his position in 2013, filing a civil claim against the estate. And Safechuck filed a similar claim. And the documentary was devastating in its impact, and it won a Primetime Emmy Award a mystery. And radio stations pulled Jackson's music from rotation, and The Simpsons removed an episode featuring his voice, and statues were taken down, and the cultural reassessment was swift and severe. And the Jackson estate responded with a $100 million lawsuit against HBO, alleging the network had violated a disparagement clause from a 1990 concert film agreement. And the legal battle over the Robson and Safechuck claims continues, and a trial is actually scheduled for November 2026. And the estate has denied all allegations and has pointed to Robson's prior sworn testimony, inconsistencies in the accuser's timelines, and the 2005 jury's unanimous acquittal. And the documentary did not settle the question that has followed Michael Jackson since 1993. It just deepened it. And then, just as the world thought it had heard everything there was to hear about Michael Jackson, just as the debate between defenders and accusers had calcified into immovable camps, a dead man's filing cabinet blew the conversation wide open again. And in January 2024, and again in December of 2025, and again in January of 2026, the US Department of Justice released millions of pages of documents, images, and videos related to Jeffrey Epstein, whom I have spoken about at length on this channel. And Michael Jackson's name appeared in the files. And for a man who had spent the last 16 years of his life under suspicion involving children, and who had been fully acquitted, the mere appearance of his name in Epstein records detonated across social media with predictable ferocity and minimal context. And the actual content of the files tells a narrow story, and the key testimony comes from Joanna Schoberger, an Epstein victim who stated in a 2016 deposition that she met Michael Jackson at Epstein's house in Palm Beach. And when lawyers asked whether she had given Michael Jackson a massage, standard questioning. Since massages were a known euphemism in Epstein's operation, Schoberg's answer was unequivocal: I did not. And no allegation of inappropriate conduct by Jackson appears anywhere in the files. No victim has accused him of anything. And on December 19, 2025, the DOJ released over 300,000 pages of documents, including previously unseen photographs, into images involved Jackson. The first showed him posing with Epstein at the Palm Beach house, and Jackson in a suit and dark sunglasses, and Epstein casually dressed, standing in front of a painting. And the second showed Jackson with Bill Clinton and Diana Ross, with children's faces redacted. And that photo was taken at a Democratic National Committee fundraiser at the Apollo Theater in Harlem on April 24, 2002. And there was no record that Epstein was present at that event, and the image was simply found among Epstein's possessions. And White House Deputy Press Secretary Abigail Jackson was subsequently called out for inserting the Apollo photo into social media posts implying it depicted a trio with Epstein's victims. The children in the photo were Michael Jackson and Diana Ross's own children. Then Matt Fiddes, Jackson's bodyguard for approximately a decade, provided immediate context for the Epstein photo, and he stated it was taken in 2003 during a week of house hunting in Palm Beach, and Jackson was considering a move to be closer to his friend Barry Gibb, with whom he was recording daily. And Epstein's residence was one of roughly 30 properties they toured with a real estate agent, and the encounter lasted no more than half a minute, a polite greeting and a photograph. Quote, "We never even knew who Epstein was," Fiddes writes, and quote, "He was not famous then," unquote. Connection to James Miskin, a real estate figure arranging property viewings for Jackson, whose attorney had a link to Epstein's circle. And CBS News and other outlets noted that Epstein routinely collected photographs with celebrities to project social legitimacy, because we know he was a fucking monster piece of shit who just needed to look famous all the time. But Michael Jackson's name does not appear in Epstein's contact book at all, and it does not appear in the flight logs of Epstein's private planes, either private planes. And there are no emails, letters, phone records, financial transactions, or any evidence of further contact between the two beyond that single house viewing encounter for half a minute. And as of February 2026, apart from Epstein himself, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Jean-Luc Brutal, no individual has been charged with a crime connected to the Epstein files, as we know if you have watched this channel. And hundreds of public figures appear in the documents without any allegation of wrongdoing. But for Michael Jackson, the Epstein files are ultimately notable for what they do not contain. But the damage was already done, not by the files themselves, but by the headlines that outran them. So another cycle of suspicion and another wave of context arriving too late to catch the accusation. And it's the story of Michael Jackson's entire afterlife. The truth never moves as fast as the rumor. And yet somehow neither does the music, because underneath all of it, the trials, the conspiracies, the files, the documentaries, The arguments that will outlive everyone reading this, there is still the work, and the work refuses to disappear. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, in a 670-square-foot house in Gary, Indiana. He died on June 25, 2009 in a rented mansion in Los Angeles at the age of 50. And between those 2 points, he became the most famous person on the planet and one of the most complicated figures the American century ever produced. And the arguments about what he was and what was done to him show no signs of ending. But the music at least is settled, and it is as close to permanent as anything human beings have made. And that is that for Michael Jackson. This was a long one. You guys have asked me to deep dive into multiple figures like Marilyn Monroe and Princess Diana and Michael Jackson. If you have anybody else you want me to deep dive into, let me know down below. I always read the comments. And until then, I will see your beautiful face, alright? Bye.